Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a new website, then get your domain name and web hosting through Bluehost. Bluehost is easy to use, has great customer support, and easily integrates with WordPress, Google Workspace, and numerous other online tools. Plus, if you get your hosting at my link, then you could potentially get your site promoted via this podcast. Get your hosting through Bluehost at placesandprofiles.com/blue. Hi, everybody. On today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast, I spoke with Patrick Novecosky about Pope St. John Paul II. Even though I'm Jewish and not Catholic, it was still fascinating to be able to learn more about this amazing person. Pope St. John Paul II is one of the few religious figures who has really had a global impact well beyond the reaches of his or her religion. He was integral in the end of communism in Eastern Europe, in the spread of Catholicism around the world, in interfaith and interdenominational outreach. Truly an extraordinary life and a whole lot to discuss with Pope St. John Paul II. So hopefully you will enjoy today's conversation with Patrick Novecosky about the remarkable life and career of Pope St. John Paul II. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today I'm speaking with Patrick Novecosky about Pope St. John Paul II. Patrick is an award-winning author, journalist, and speaker with a passion for the new evangelization and Pope St. John Paul II, whom he met 5 times. He is an international public speaker, runs Nova Media, and is the author of 100 Ways John Paul II Changed the World. You can follow his work at booksbypatrick.com and at catholicpublicist.com. You can also find him on Facebook and LinkedIn. For more information, please check out the show notes page of this episode at placesandprofiles.com/8. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Adam.
Well, I appreciate you joining me. Thank you so much. So let's get started just on your interest in Pope St. John Paul II. I mentioned in the introduction that you've met him 5 times, but how did your interest and fascination in him come about? Why would he be the figure out of everyone that you could have written about in Catholic history, any pope you could have written about? Why would he be the one that you would write a book about? What's unique about him that would bring about this level of interest in his life and in his work?
Yeah, my interest in John Paul II was peaked probably 40 years ago, actually 45 years ago, when I was just a kid and he was elected the first Polish pope, the first non-Italian pope in over 400 years. And the world kind of took a pause and went, wait, what? The Pope's not Italian? It was a kind of a game changer. And we had literally just lost John Paul I after 33 days as Pope. So I remember the fact that I'm of Polish origin, Novecosky being a Polish name, and here we've got a Polish Pope, and there's a buzz about this young guy. He was 58 years old, and it was in the news, and so I remember that vaguely because I was only 10, and then a few years later, when I was 16, I grew up in Western Canada in the province of Saskatchewan. And in 1984, John Paul II became the first pope ever to visit Canada. And it was unprecedented. He toured coast to coast and drew huge crowds. And I remember it was in the news every day. But I remember some of our church ladies were going to get in a car and drive to Winnipeg to see the Pope. And they invited me to go. I don't remember exactly why I didn't go, but it was probably because they were church ladies and they were in their 40s and I was a teenager. And that was like, thank you, but no thank you. But at the same time, it was another opportunity to hear about this man and how he was really revolutionizing the papacy and doing things that no pope had ever done before. And then my interest in him kind of waned for a little bit until I was into my late 20s. And I started working in the Catholic Church. I worked as an editor and writer for several magazines and newspapers. And I was hired by a Catholic Order of Priests and Brothers in Western Massachusetts, the Marians of the Immaculate Conception, to be the editor of their magazine. I'd only been there, it was since 1996. I'd only been working for them for a few months, and I won a trip for 2 to Cancun. And that led to a chain of events where I met John Paul II 5 times.
All right, now I want to go back to something that you mentioned early in your response, and that is that Pope John Paul II was the first non-Italian pope in over 400 years.
Yeah.
Of course, both of his successors have been non-Italian, where Benedict XVI was German and now Francis is from Argentina. And there's speculation that whenever the day comes that Francis is no longer with us and it's being determined who his replacement will be, that person will likely not be Italian. There's speculation it could be an American. I've even heard that it could be a Sri Lankan. So the idea of not having Italian Pope now seems normal, but in 1978, as you said, it was not. So just how significant was it that he was a non-Italian becoming a pope? Can you place that into the proper context of the time for us?
Yeah, absolutely. It was, like I said, there were 400 years of Italian popes, and it was just the thing that people expected. But I think what happened was, we had John Paul I, who took the names of his predecessors, Pope Paul VI and Pope John the 23rd, and put those names together and did something that no pope had ever done before. He put two names together. It was a Pope Leo or a Pope Pius or a Pope Paul, but never a hyphenated, in a sense, a hyphenated name. And he also did away with some of the regal type things of the papacy. He got rid of the Pope. He wore the papal tiara just once, and then kind of like, yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. They used to carry the Pope on the shoulders of 12 men into the cathedral in St. Peter's, and he said, we're not going to do that anymore. This is a Pope who was only in the chair of St. Peter for 33 days, but made so many sweeping changes and was really beloved. So when John Paul II was elected, I think it was, they were in the conclave to elect the new Pope, and they're like, I think God is telling us to do something different. There was a buzz about Karol Wojtyła prior to his election. When they elected John Paul I, he was considered to be, papabile, like able to be the Pope. So I think that the fact that this John Paul I died almost immediately after being elected kind of shook them up and said, God and the Holy Spirit are asking us to do something different. It really was a game changer. That whole 1978, where we had three popes, Paul VI, John Paul I, John Paul II, within 3 months, was really revolutionary. And they say of John Paul II that when he was elected Pope, he already knew how to be Pope. He had spent so much time in Rome. He was a master of a dozen languages, and he was just ready to go.
All right, and we'll obviously come back to his pontificate here shortly and some of the ways that he revolutionized the papacy, as you said earlier during this conversation. But I want to go back to the part of his life before he was Pope John Paul II. What are some of the key things about his childhood, about his upbringing that shaped who he became? How did he make the decision to study theology and get deeply involved in the Catholic Church as a younger man?
Yeah, he grew up in central Poland, a place called Wadowice, where he was born in May of 1920. And he was in a community that had a lot of Jewish people, and he became friends with Jewish people. Quite often he loved soccer. He was always a kid who loved sports, and he would often volunteer to play goalie for the Jewish boys against the Catholic boys. And got to be a very good athlete, a very good goalie. And they called him Lolek. That was his nickname. So, it was kind of a multicultural type situation that he grew up in. And some of the formative things that happened to him when he was young, he was 8, 9 years old when his mother passed away. She had congestive heart failure. He was 12 years old when his older brother, Edmund, who was a doctor, died at 26 years old, contracted a disease and passed away relatively quickly. And then it was just young Karol Wojtyła and his father. And again, he gravitated towards sports, and his real passion was acting. He loved kind of the avant-garde theater, not mainstream stuff, but he was very steeped in Polish literature and poetry, and that was kind of the thing that was really captivating in those days. 18 years old, he moves to Krakow with his dad, and they're only there for a little while. Karol was 20 years old when his father, who was a military man, passed away, and he was left abandoned. He said he felt like an orphan because everyone that he loved had died. And shortly after that, the Nazi tanks rolled in and took over Poland, and he started to see the ideology of the Nazis and the way they treated particularly the Jewish people. But it was a brutal war and takeover of Poland. That was formative for him. And I think at that point, he decided to join the seminary and become a seminarian rather than pursuing acting. His friends were really surprised that he didn't pursue acting as a career. And people should know, too, that he really took his life into his hands by deciding to become a seminarian, because at that point, the Nazis were shooting priests and seminarians openly. They were rounding them up and taking them off to the concentration camps. And so just the fact that he opted for the priesthood was a very bold move. And he studied in the Archbishop's residence with a small group of seminarians. And by the time the war ended, of course, the Soviet Union kind of absorbed Poland. And before he's even ordained a priest, he's observed Nazism and communism. Very formative for him as far as his teaching would go for the rest of his career as a priest and bishop and pope.
Okay, yeah. So he embarks on this career of being a priest, then a bishop, ultimately becoming pope. For those who are listening who are maybe not as familiar with how this process works, what are typical steps that someone would undergo from entering the priesthood, developing an interest in theology, to eventually becoming pope if they are one of the individuals who becomes pope? And in what ways was John Paul II's path to becoming pope over his decades of being involved in theology in the Catholic Church? In what ways was that ordinary, and in what ways was that not ordinary beyond just his not being Italian?
Sure. Setting the stage a little bit, when the communists took over Poland, it was a very different situation than it was in Russia. In Russia, every single Roman Catholic entity was dissolved. Priests were killed, bishops were killed, they were sent out of the country. There was not a Catholic hospital, a Catholic church, primarily because the communists knew that the ruling entity was in Rome and they couldn't control them the way they could the Orthodox Church, which was based in Moscow. So Poland, being an overwhelmingly Catholic country, was a problem for them. They could not scrub Catholicism from Poland because it was so deeply embedded over 1,000 years of Catholicism, and it was like I said, the predominant religion in Poland. They would essentially have to rip the heart out of Poland in order to do away with Catholicism. So they allowed the Catholic Church to exist. They were monitoring, taking notes and dossiers on every single Catholic leader in Poland. And they tried very hard over the course of decades to erase Catholicism from Poland. So his path was first as a priest, ordained, assigned to a parish. His primary ministry as a young priest was to young people. And young people, if you could imagine, in Poland after the Second World War, after the Nazis fell and the communists took over Poland, was very suspicious. The young people were very suspicious of government. They were suspicious of authority. They had gone through the Nazis, the communists, and now this whole takeover of their nation and their culture. And they didn't really want to ask too many questions out in the open. So Father Wojtyła, the future pope, became a trusted figure for young people, and he would take them kayaking and hiking, and once they were out of the city in the wilderness, they felt free to ask him questions. questions about philosophy and theology and the meaning of life, the big questions that he would go on to write about as priest, bishop, and pope. So his path was, first of all, really absorbed in young people, and we'll see later on that he founded World Youth Day and did a lot of things with young people. But the hierarchy of the church, his bishop understood that this was a brilliant young man who connected with people. He was charismatic. He was athletic. He was a great philosopher. That was his primary passion, was philosophy, the philosophy of the human person. Who are we as people created in the image and likeness of God? And so they sent him off to Rome, and he studied in Rome. He studied in France. He traveled to the United States in the late 60s. And they saw that he had leadership qualities. The communists, however, saw him as bookish. They saw that this guy he's not a threat to us because he's a guy that reads books all day and is not really all that challenging to our political ideology. So when they recommended him to become the auxiliary bishop of Krakow, the communists really didn't push back on that very much, and they in a sense allowed it to happen. Then he was nominated to be the Archbishop Cardinal of Krakow in the early 60s, and they started to notice him a little bit more because, of course, he's a rising figure, but they didn't really see him as much of a threat, even until he became Pope. Once he became Pope, they recognized him as a threat because here's someone from the essentially the heart of communist Eastern Europe rising to the world stage, doing something that had never been done in the history of the world, the first Slavic Pope, the first Polish Pope. And they started to see in him a real threat. And we can talk a little bit more about it as we move into the assassination attempt in 1981 on his life.
Yeah, and a lot of the topics that you brought up there, World Youth Day, the assassination attempt on his life, these are things that we will return to here in a few moments. But I want to go back to the 1960s because there was a critical moment in the development of the Catholic Church that in many ways led to widespread reform and change and has shaped the way that the Catholic Church is viewed today and the way that it functions in many ways today. And that's the Second Vatican Conference, or Vatican II. Now, this obviously precedes John Paul II being Pope, with this being from 1962 to 1965 during the papacies of John the 23rd and Paul VI. But this is an event that nonetheless had an impact on John Paul II, as it has the entirety of the Catholic Church in so many ways in the decades since then. So for someone who's listening to this and maybe they're vaguely aware of Vatican II, or maybe they've never heard it before, what is so significant about Vatican II, and how does the occurrence of Vatican II influence John Paul II and shape his theology and what he will eventually go on to do after becoming Pope a decade and a half later?
Yeah, great questions. Let's start with what is a church council. So the Catholic Church was founded by Jesus in 30 AD or so, and he appointed his 12 apostles as the first priests, the first bishops. And moving forward through the centuries, there were various church councils from the first 100 years of the church. There were councils to decide questions of what is happening in the world and what do we teach based on how the world is changing and the challenges to our faith, and what is God saying to the church at this point in history. And I think John the 23rd in the early 60s recognized that the world was changing very quickly. There had been the First Vatican Council. And don't quote me because I'm not a historian or a theologian, but I believe it was less than 100 years prior, late 1800s, early. We can look it up. But so this council that John the 23rd called in 1963 was to address what is God? What is the Holy Spirit saying to the Catholic Church at this point in history when there's such rapid change in the culture, particularly in the Western world? And so he brought all of the bishops of the world together to pray and to ask and to discern those questions. And Karol Wojtyła, named a bishop in 1962, was one of the youngest bishops at the beginning of the Second Vatican Council. And over those years of the council, of the various meetings of the bishops, he became one of the most influential. He had a great input to several documents, particularly the Pastoral Constitution of the Church that came out of the Second Vatican Council. And it was primarily because of his philosophical take on the human person, which really became the cornerstone of his teaching throughout his papacy. And I think at this point, a lot of the bishops really took notice of him because he was, as I said before, he was articulate. He was able to speak in several languages and really understood and was able to express beautifully the teachings of the church and express a direction for the church that it would go. And throughout his pontificate, he also unpacked the council. It was one of the greatest things that he did was that he referred back to the council in all of his encyclicals, and most of his writings, you'll see a reference back to the council, kind of helping us to understand the teachings that came out of the Second Vatican Council.
All right, so let's move forward in time and let's fast forward to John Paul II's pontificate. Earlier, you mentioned that he revolutionized the papacy and that he did things that no pope had ever done before. Can you flesh that out in a little more detail? And how did he revolutionize the papacy? And what are some of the things that he did that were unprecedented for popes prior to him?
Many of the popes didn't even leave the Vatican. Several of them didn't leave Rome. Several of them never set foot out of Italy. The first pope to get on an airplane was John the 23rd. I think John the 23rd. The first pope to leave Italy in many years was Paul VI. He came to the United States. I think it was in 1965. He traveled to Israel. But popes really didn't travel very much at all. Of course, John Paul I didn't have much of a chance to travel. So the fact that John Paul II traveled to, I believe, 129 countries, he traveled to 129 countries. He racked up almost 700,000 air miles, traveling the world through the 26 and a half years of his papacy. He set a new bar for popes, and we saw that with Pope Benedict and now Pope Francis. They're globetrotters because they understand that they need to take the gospel on the road, so to speak. One unique thing that people perhaps don't know about John Paul II is that he was seen live in person by more people than any human being who ever lived. And I get people that push back every once in a while. They say, well, what about the Rolling Stones? They've been around for 60 years. John Paul was only 26 years. And well, John Paul regularly drew crowds of 1 million people. So if you think about that, how many stadiums do you have to pack to get 1 million people? And he did it in one day. 7 million people came to see him for the closing mass at World Youth Day in Manila in the early 90s. You've got to tour for a very long time to hit 7 million. So the Rolling Stones might come in a close second, well, a distant second, but he was seen live by more people than any human being who ever lived. And that says a lot for him as a person, and his popularity never waned as he got older. I remember when he came to World Youth Day in 1993 in Denver, and the press were kind of like, what young person is going to come out to see this old guy and travel, across the country to see an old pope? And he drew historic crowds, biggest crowds. He in 1979, he drew 600,000 people to a cornfield in Iowa. Just astounding numbers of people that came out to see him, and that it was really precedent setting. And I could talk more about that. I mean, He wrote dozens of encyclicals and, really taught, as I said, the importance of the human person, the inviolable dignity of the human person, from the time of conception to the time of natural death, that each person is created for a purpose, made in love, for love, and by love. And that was a message that kind of cut to the heart of the hedonistic culture that came out of the 1950s and 60s, and I think really resonated in the hearts, particularly of young people.
Now, going back to his traveling exploits, in what ways did this unprecedented level of travel from John Paul II allow the Catholic Church to extend its influence and really grow in parts of the Americas and parts of Africa, in places where the Catholic Church maybe was not as developed at the beginning of John Paul II's pontificate as it is sitting here today in 2023?
Yeah, if not for his travel, I don't think people would have talked as much about Catholicism and the Catholic Church. So, that we as human beings are made for relationship, and we're made for discussion. We're made for talking. We're made for fleshing out ideas and thoughts, and ultimately the best way to live. And that's philosophy. That's an understanding of who we are and how we're wired. And the fact that he traveled so extensively got people talking in the media about the Catholic Church, got people talking at the local level about the Catholic Church. There are so many people that saw him live in person that would sit back in their chair, Catholics and non-Catholics, and they would say, I felt like he was talking right to me. I'm in a crowd of 1 million people, and I feel like he's talking right to my heart. He really had this beautiful charisma that he used to get people to think about the deeper issues, the deeper questions about, again, who we are as people. And that started, I think, what people call the JP2 revolution. The vocations started to have an uptick from the decline of the 1960s and 70s. And I think people started to pay far more attention to Catholicism than had been since the council, for sure. The council ended in 65. And I think people weren't talking about the Catholic Church very much from the late 60s into the early 80s.
All right, and I want to return to one of these events where we see these enormous crowds and this enormous influence of John Paul II in different parts of the world. And you've mentioned this event a handful of times already, but that's World Youth Day. And of course, this has been in the news lately because they just had World Youth Day in Lisbon, Portugal, and Pope Francis gave an enormous mass in Lisbon just a handful of weeks ago at the most recent World Youth Day here in 2023. But what exactly is World Youth Day for someone who's not overly familiar with it? And you've touched on this some already, but can you go into a little more detail about just how revolutionary of an idea this was for the Catholic Church and for John Paul II to be embarking on this project of World Youth Day?
Yeah, I really think it grew out of his ministry as a young priest to young people in Poland. And he really had a passion for the hearts of young people who, as you know, when we're in that age demographic between, say, 16 and 25, and we're trying to figure out, who are we? What am I? What's the purpose of life? And what should I do with my life? And is my life worth living? Is because there's a lot of, life is difficult. And when you're parsing those ideas as a young person, we all need some guidance. And the world is ready to give us some guidance. It's all about stuff. It's all about, grabbing as much as you can. It's all about pleasure. It's all about material possessions. It's all about politics. It's all about this or that. John Paul II preached that it's about something bigger than all of that. It's about a bigger idea, a bigger purpose. And he saw that young people were really looking for answers. And so even early in his papacy, he would have gatherings of young people and they would chant, JP2, we love you. And he would chant back to them, JP2, he loves you. and this affection that he had, he really drew on the energy of young people. So in the early 80s, there was a gathering of young people. I think it was in Paris, and this idea developed from that. Let's do this on a global scale and do it every 2 to 3 years, and we'll pick a new city and move it around. And I think the first World Youth Day was in Rome, and it just spawned this movement of people coming from all over the world, first to learn about their faith, to celebrate their faith, to gather with other Catholics, and to share some. To learn and to celebrate, and I think we saw that in Lisbon, great jubilation, and people coming from everywhere just to kind of not just to see the Pope, but to gather as young Catholics and express our joy in our faith.
All right, now I want to go back before World Youth Day chronologically to some events that are a little less pleasant to discuss, but that you alluded to earlier, and that's some of these assassination attempts that Pope John Paul II faced. You mentioned in 1981 in particular that he faced an assassination attempt, but what information, what details can you provide on these sorts of threats on his life, and in what ways did those shape his papacy and his later years?
Yeah, interestingly, since I wrote my book, I've learned that there was an attempt on his life in the Philippines. Apparently, a priest tried to stab him and was detained. Someone tried to take his life in Miami in 1987, and I think the Secret Service grabbed that guy. But I think the biggest threat to his life, of course, was the assassination attempt at May 13th, 1981 in St. Peter's Square. The person who wrote the foreword to my book, Paul Kengor, wrote a beautiful book called The Pope and the President about John Paul II and Ronald Reagan and their friendship and their work collaboration to help end Soviet communism in Eastern Europe. When John Paul II was elected, the Politburo in Moscow stood up and really noticed that, hey, we've got a world leader who's from the heart of Poland, who could be a threat to our ideology, to our regime, and they started to monitor his activity even more closely, and they saw that he was not afraid. His first trip to Poland as Pope, June of 1979, was truly revolutionary. Here's a Pope in communist Poland who is preaching to the hearts of people. He didn't talk about politics. He didn't talk about their ideology. He just awakened in their hearts a desire to live their faith passionately. So John Paul II became a real threat to communism, particularly to the regime in Poland, because of he being so outspoken about the evils of communism, as the church had actually written about for decades before him. But the threat really was that he was awakening this desire to in the hearts of Polish people to be renewed in their faith. So Paul Kengor, in his book, kind of unpacks this. He discovered that the GRU, which is the Secret Service branch of the Soviet military, hatched a plot to hire an assassin through Bulgaria. They hired a Turkish gunman through their network in Bulgaria to assassinate John Paul II. And his name is Muhammad Ali Aja. He was a professional assassin, 23 years old. They had painstakingly planned out what was going to happen on May 13th, 1981. And the plan did not go according to what they wanted. They had a second person who was going to set off an explosive device after Aja fired his bullets. He fired, I think, 8 bullets. 2 of them hit John Paul II. One of the bullets lodged very close to his heart. The gunman was tackled by a nun, interestingly, and then a security guy grabbed him, and he was apprehended. John Paul II was rushed to the hospital, was in the hospital for weeks and numerous surgeries, and this just several weeks after Ronald Reagan was shot in Washington, D.C. So horrific series of events. But John Paul II really believed that Mary, the Mother of God, saved his life. May 13th is the Feast of Our Lady of Fatima, and that really brought a spotlight on the apparitions in Fatima. Even Ronald Reagan became very curious as to these apparitions that happened in Fatima, Portugal in 1913. So, horrific series of events, but I think the fact that those two world leaders had assassination attempts so close together really bonded them together. They had never met before. They met, I think, the following year, 1982, and developed a very close friendship and close collaboration that led to the end of the Soviet Union in the late 80s.
Yeah, so let's flesh that out a little more for the next several minutes. How John Paul II and Ronald Reagan, for that matter, how what they did helped bring about the end of the Soviet Union and the end of communism in Eastern Europe. Because for those who are not Catholic, it seems like that probably is the greatest source of his legacy, or at least the part of his legacy that is most widely known outside of the Catholic Church, is the role that John Paul II played in pushing back and fighting against dictatorships and ultimately helping to bring about the end of communism in Eastern Europe. So can you go into a little more detail on the role that he played and just how influential John Paul II was in bringing about the end of these communist dictatorships across Eastern Europe?
I alluded to this a little bit earlier, that in June of 1979, when John Paul II went to Poland for the first time as Pope, I really call that visit the first crack in the Iron Curtain. There are a lot of things that we're learning even now about the communist regime, the USSR, in the 1970s, 1980s, and how a lot of the power and prestige and the wealth that they alluded to have, and the control that they alluded to have, was really just a facade, and that it was already crumbling. John Paul II went into Poland as a conquering hero. He drew millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people watched him on TV, and it really awakened in the hearts of the Polish people a vibrance for their faith. During his homily, his first homily in Krakow, surrounded by 1 million people, people started to chant just spontaneously, "We want God. We want God." And this is after 50 years of the government saying there is no God. It's very clear in communist teaching that God and communism cannot coexist. The God is the enemy of communism. And so the Polish people never forgot their passion for God, even though the culture was telling them something different, the government was telling them something different. And I think that set off shockwaves throughout all of Eastern Europe, and even Russia itself, the heart of communist, the biggest communist government in the world in the USSR. So what John Paul II did from there, he came back to Poland several times under communism. He worked collaboratively with Ronald Reagan. They shared lots of intelligence back and forth. They established diplomatic relations between the United States and the Holy See, which had never been done before. Ronald Reagan appointed the first ambassador to the Holy See, and the Holy See appointed a papal nuncio, which is in a sense an ambassador to the United States. A lot of the documents that are still classified, interestingly, even decades after the end of the Soviet Union, a lot of that intelligence is still classified. But just the fact that John Paul II was very clear in teaching the dignity of the human person, which is highly contrary to the teachings of communism, where the philosophy of the human person is 180 different than that teaching. They under communism, the human person is just there to serve the state. That you're just a cog in the wheel. But John Paul II, his teaching was that each person has a particular purpose and dignity. That family is an integral part of society and the building block of society. And under communism, the family was, again, only to serve the state. So, and I think particularly it was John Paul's philosophy, his travel, and his diplomatic relations that he built around the world that helped to end the Soviet Union. And we also talked about Ronald Reagan and the arms race. I think Reagan, who abhorred nuclear weapons, only escalated the building nuclear weapons because he knew that the Soviet Union would want to keep up and to build and build and build and build, which eventually bankrupted, in a sense, the Soviet Union. And the facade that I alluded to earlier, it just crumbled. And by the end of 1989, the Soviet Union was no more, and many of the Soviet satellite states returned to independence, including Ukraine.
If you're interested in starting a website, then use Bluehost. I use Bluehost for placesandprofiles.com, and it's great. Their customer support is quick, responsive, and helpful, and it works well with WordPress, WooCommerce, Google Workspace, and countless other online tools. As an added bonus, if you get your domain name or hosting through my Bluehost link, then I will mention your website on the show and link to your website on placesandprofiles.com, as long as your website is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Bluehost and get your domain name and hosting today by going to placesandprofiles.com/blue. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/blue. You've talked about the teachings of John Paul II and alluded to some of his views on theology several times over the course of this conversation. But of course, there were a lot of significant theological developments during his pontificate. The development of a new code of canon law, the issuing of the official catechism of the Catholic Church, those both occurred during his time as Pope. So what can you tell us about this new code of canon law, about the catechism of the Catholic Church that John Paul II helped set into effect? What are some of the ways that has shaped the Catholic Church since then, and that those things really shaped his pontificate?
Yeah, I'm not as up to date on the new code of canon law that John Paul II instituted. I can talk a little bit about it. It was basically a reorganization of the church's teaching. The code of canon law is essentially church law, and it's centuries old. And John Paul II instituted these reforms and changes, but basically making it a little bit more accessible and better organized and modern. And that's really all, because it's not my primary expertise. But those are the few little things that I know about it. The Catechism of the Catholic Church is a very interesting development as well. Simply, what happened was 20 years after the end of the Second Vatican Council, 1985, council ended in 65. In 1985, there was a synod of bishops, so a gathering of bishops in Rome. And one of the recommendations they made, it was to have a new universal catechism. The previous universal catechism was called the Roman Catechism. And I can't give you the exact date when that came out, but it was centuries old. I believe it was 1800s when it came out. So the recommendation was to come up with this new catechism, universal catechism, which would universal meaning for the entire church all over the world. And he had a lot of pushback from bishops who would say, Holy Father, we don't need a new catechism. We have a catechism. It works fine. And catechisms to this point had been in a Q&A form. And some of them had been local. So there was the Baltimore Catechism that was promulgated here in the United States by the American bishops, and very widely used throughout the 20th century in the United States. But John Paul II persevered. He thought, we had this council 20 years ago, and there's still a lot of confusion. There's a lot of bad teaching happening in the church. And we need to say definitively what the church teaches and why the church teaches it, so that everybody is clear on what Catholicism is all about. And anyone who's kind of looked at the church particularly through the 20th century, there was a lot of dissension. There was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of people taking the teachings of the church and going in one direction or another direction. And he understood that there needed to be clarity in teaching. And I think part of that also goes back to his decision to have this new code of canon law, clarity in teaching. So I love the fact that he persevered and had the catechism published. I think it was first published in French in 1992, English in 1994, and that it really, there's only one organization, one church in the world, one religion in the church that has such clarity in its teaching that sets out explicitly what it teaches, why it teaches it, and the background behind all of that. So I'm sure that many of your listeners are familiar with Father Mike Schmitz, and he over the last couple of years, he's had this Bible in a Year podcast, hit #1 around the world. And about a year ago, they announced that he was going to do the Catechism in a year. And even though I'm a fan of the Catechism, even though I'm a friend and a fan of Father Mike Schmitz, I thought, who's going to care about the Catechism of the Catholic Church other than, on fire devout Catholics? Maybe. But he proved me wrong. January of this year, the Catechism in a Year podcast became the #1 podcast on the planet. Astounding people who never thought that would be possible. And in a sense, I shouldn't be surprised, because when the Catechism of the Catholic Church was first published in English, it became a universal bestseller. People could buy it in the grocery store checkout, and it sold by the hundreds of thousands. Dozens of languages, has been translated into dozens of languages. One of the best-selling books of the 20th century is the Catechism of the Catholic Church, thanks to John Paul II.
Well, yeah, and of course, the clarity, as you mentioned, that he provided internally within the Catholic Church was remarkable. But he also changed the shape of the Catholic Church, the outlook of the Catholic Church externally, not just in opposition to communism and dictatorships, as we talked about earlier, and not just through travel, but also the relations that the Catholic Church had with other Christian denominations and even with other religions like Judaism and Islam. And maybe in some ways that was that traces back to John Paul II's childhood and the heavy population of Jews where he grew up in Poland and the Nazi occupation there, and some of those horrors that he saw as a younger man. But in what ways did the Catholic Church's relations with other Christian denominations, with non-Christian faiths, in what ways did that change during John Paul II's pontificate?
I think a lot of it, this interreligious dialogue that John Paul II sparked, comes from his philosophy of the human person, that we as human beings can't be coerced into any ideology or any religion, and that we need to be free to choose how we will live and what we will believe, and that we can propose a way to live. And that was really at the core of what he would say to other religious leaders, that you can't coerce people to be Muslim. You can't coerce people to be Jewish. You have to propose. And he would always say this, the church, the Catholic Church doesn't impose, it proposes. It proposes a way to live. It proposes these ideas of who Jesus is, who God is, who the Holy Spirit is, and who we are as human persons. So he would say to people, if you're Jewish, be the best Jew you can be. If you're Muslim, be the best Muslim you can be and pursue truth, and you will find God. And so he was the first pope ever to visit a mosque, first pope to visit a synagogue, and he gathered religious leaders in Assisi in the spirit of St. Francis to come together, and harshly criticized by secular media, harshly criticized by a lot of people in the Catholic Church for setting foot in a mosque, setting foot in a synagogue, and for bringing together religious leaders to talk and dialogue. They saw that as kind of caving from being a hardcore Catholic. And for him, for John Paul II, it really wasn't about convincing these other faith leaders to become Catholic. It was about breaking down barriers, building trust, building understanding, building relationship. We talked about that a little bit earlier, that we're made for relationship. And without relationship, I found this in particularly in my earlier work in community relations, that it's easy to criticize someone if you never sat down across the table from them and had coffee with them. So we need to get together with people and really discuss these ideas at a higher level. And I think John Paul II understood that needed to happen in order to foster just peace and understanding and break down animosity. And I think it was a great success, and followed his successors followed in his footsteps in that regard.
Sure. Now, maybe three more questions or so that I want to get to before we wrap up for today. And this next one is on an extremely unpleasant topic, and I hate to bring it up, but given that we're conducting this interview in 2023, I feel almost obligated to ask about this in some way, shape, or form. And unfortunately, there have been a number of scandals in the Catholic Church connected to sexual abuse, especially with minors, that have really shaped the way the Catholic Church, unfortunately, has been viewed in the West in recent years. Now, John Paul II, he passed away in 2005, so we're going back 18 years. But did these sorts of scandals, how did those influence his pontificate, and how did they shape John Paul II's tenure as Pope as those scandals began to pop up?
Yeah, great question, a necessary question. First of all, there is no excuse for anyone to abuse a child, physically, sexually, emotionally, in any way, shape, or form. Catholic clergy, Catholic priests, Catholic leaders need to have a much higher bar than anyone else, simply because these are leaders who have earned or have the trust by default of people in their charge. And so the church has made it very clear that there is no excuse for abuse of children or vulnerable people at any level. Now, going back to, if you will, the roots of this scandal, and I've read books on this. I've written a little bit about it, but I've thought about it so much that, particularly in the West, the Catholic Church, early 20th century, was vibrant. It was universal. First World War came along. Second World War came along. The masculine men were called away to war. They fought in these wars. They died in these wars. They secured the freedom of the Western world. As an unfortunate consequence of that, if you will, the less masculine men were not at war. They were at home. And the seminaries opened their arms to men who were less masculine. And not all of them homosexual. Some of them were. That changed the priesthood in the Western world. And from the 1930s, 1940s, particularly in the 1950s, the priesthood was a different thing. And as these men became leaders in their parish, became bishops, they would appoint and gravitate toward moving forward in the hierarchy men who were like-minded. Now, you also look at the dissension that was happening in the Catholic Church, particularly in the 60s. Second Vatican Council came along. There was a lot of confusion about what it taught, how it taught it, openness to new ideas and new ways of expressing ourselves as Catholics. And by this time, there were a lot of effeminate priests and, to be frank, a lot of homosexual priests. My friend Bill Donahue from the Catholic League is a sociologist. He has a PhD in sociology. He's written extensively on the roots of this crisis and points to the fact that there was that the overwhelming majority of abuse cases were perpetrated on post-pubescent males by homosexual clergy. That it really wasn't a pedophilia crisis although that did occur in rare occasions. But the vast, vast, vast majority were homosexual priests with post-pubescent males. So as awful as that is, that's the reality that John Paul II inherited, that he tried to change. He reformed seminaries. He attracted to the priesthood a vibrant, masculine, heterosexual leaning men to be priests, to be celibate priests. And there was a whole wave of young men who saw him as this really athletic, dynamic pope that they wanted to emulate. They wanted to be like him. And that changed vastly. It didn't solve the problem, but the tenor of the priesthood and the seminaries really started to change with this wave of young men in the 1990s and even after John Paul II's death in 2005. So he made no excuses for the abuse crisis. I think he died before we understood the scope and the depth of the sludge that was happening in the Catholic Church. And unfortunately, Pope Benedict was the cleanup man. And I don't think that Pope Benedict felt up to the task of the depravity that he saw in this abuse crisis. And it was one of the things I think that led to his resignation and the election of Pope Francis.
Now, I wasn't planning on asking this question, but since you mentioned homosexuality a few times in that last answer, in what ways did the Catholic Church's views on homosexuality either get changed or clarified during John Paul II's pontificate?
Yeah, the Catechism of the Catholic Church makes it abundantly clear that people who have an inclination to a same-sex attraction are to be respected as human persons. That sexual love is ordained by God, by our nature, by how we're built, how we are wired in a sense for the intimate union of male and female, and that everyone who is not married to someone of the, first of all, and this comes back to the philosophy and the theology of human persons, that it's very clear in the Bible that and throughout the history of the church that marriage is between one man, one woman, made for life, made for their lives, that they're married from the time they get married until one of them passes away, and that sexual love is made for married couples. Everyone who is not a married couple is called to a celibate life. So that means if you're a single man or a single woman and you're not married in the understanding of what marriage really is, and that's been confused, unfortunately. But that was the teaching that John Paul II unpacked. And that's been the consistent teaching of all Christian churches until the 20th century. So he kind of put some flesh on those bones. And if you go to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it really unpacks the dignity of the human person, no matter what our inclination is. That people who have this same-sex attraction are called to be respected. They're called to live and be treated with great dignity. So there are ministries in the Catholic Church that minister to people who have homosexual inclinations. I have a very good friend who was a male model in New York in the 1970s and 1980s. And lived an extravagant homosexual life, had a radical conversion to Catholicism, and was friends with Mother Angelica, the founder of EWTN, late in her life, and that led to his conversion. He still has homosexual inclinations. He's living a celibate life. He's living a joyful life. He's living a very fulfilled single life. So I really think that there's a template for people who have homosexual inclinations to live a life of holiness. And it's not easy. I mean, I've had these long conversations with him. It's very, very difficult. But then again, most people have something in their life that is very difficult. We all have our crosses, and Jesus said, pick up your cross and carry it and follow me. And for all of us, that cross is something different.
All right. So John Paul II, his papacy comes to an end with his passing in 2005. And in pretty short order, he becomes beatified and canonized. In fact, being canonized, correct me if I'm wrong, but at the same time as John the 23rd, even though John the 23rd passed away 42 years prior to John Paul II. So for someone who's listening and doesn't know what beatification and canonization are, first of all, what are they? And then secondly, how did these processes come about so quickly for John Paul II? And was there anything particularly unusual about the way these processes were applied in his context?
Great questions. First of all, I think we have to understand what is a saint. First of all, each of us is called to sanctity. We're called to live a holy life, and it doesn't mean that we live a perfect life. Saints saints are simply our role models who have gone before us, who have shown us that living a holy life is possible, and that saints are recognized by the church simply to say this person is truly with God in heaven. That's really all it is. It's the church recognizing the fact that they've made it. They've gone to a place with God in heaven that we're all called to. So John Paul II certainly wasn't a perfect human being. He certainly understood that he was a sinful human being. He made a lot of mistakes. You live your life on the world stage for 26 and a half years. The world is going to know a lot of the mistakes that you made, and he made them. But at the same time, he lived his life pursuing God. I always say that John Paul II's prayer life, the hours and hours a day he spent in prayer, were kind of like a nuclear engine that powered everything else that he did: his writing, his speaking, his traveling, his teaching. That he was able to accomplish all of this because of the prayer and God working through him, and essentially surrendering his life to what God wanted him to do and say and think and be. And so when he died, there were a lot of people who were in St. Peter's Square saying "Santo subito," the Italian for "make him a saint now." And his successor, Pope Benedict XVI, waived this. There's typically a waiting period for the canonization process to begin, and the Pope has the ability to waive that waiting period and just say, we'll just take the process starting now. So in order to be declared a saint in the Catholic Church, the first step is an examination of the person's life. They have to have all of their writing and their speeches and their whole life examined, and the church has to declare officially that they lived the heroic virtues, that they lived a life pursuing God. And that's the first step. So then they become declared a servant of God after the heroic virtues are proclaimed. After that happens, the church, in a sense, waits for a miracle. So beatification is the next step. So, and what we mean by a miracle is that someone has to ask for his intercession from heaven to have something happen. So I don't remember exactly the beatification miracle for John Paul II. There was one of the miracles was a nun, a French nun, who was healed miraculously, and the other one I think was a boy. But so the miracle has to be instant. It has to happen, and typically these miracles are medical healings. Okay, so it has to be instant, it has to be lasting, and it has to be inexplicable by science. So if it happens over the course of time, not a miracle. if it happens and it's there's a healing, but then there's a relapse, not a miracle. And what was the other one I said? Instant, lasting, and
it can't immediately be explained by science.
Yes, and that science cannot explain it. So, and the church has an extensive process to examine this, and there are people on these panels of people who examine these miracles who are not Catholic. They have an expertise in medicine or something else having to do with that particular healing. And so there were two miracles for John Paul II's, one for his beatification, one for his healing, and they were ratified by the Vatican, and he was elevated to the status of saint. I was actually at his canonization mass in St. Peter's Square and got to witness that, which was really pretty exhilarating. He was canonized at the same time as John the 23rd, who called the Second Vatican Council. And again, John the 23rd, very holy man, jovial pope, really a world-changing pope himself. I don't know the backstory behind him, but I guess the miracles didn't happen the way, as quickly as they did for John Paul II, but nonetheless a saint.
All right, and one final question for you before we wrap up for today. You've made indirect comparisons between John Paul II and his two successors a handful of times, Benedict XVI and Francis. But what else can we say now that John Paul II has been deceased for 18 years? We have a little more perspective on his life looking back. How else can we compare him to his successors, and how does that really shape his legacy and his significance in the present day?
Pope Benedict XVI was also a young bishop at the Second Vatican Council. He was primarily a theologian, whereas John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, was primarily a philosopher. They were both bishops during the Second Vatican Council. They didn't meet until the conclave that elected John Paul I in 1978. And they got to know each other a little bit better. They knew each other by reputation. And then when John Paul II was elected in the fall of 1978, he asked Cardinal Ratzinger, later Benedict XVI, to come and work with him at the Vatican as the head of the doctrine part of the Catholic Church, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And at that point, Ratzinger had only been Archbishop of Munich for a few years, and he kind of put him off. He said, I'm kind of new here, and give me some time. But John Paul II kept asking, and then I think it was late 1981, early 82, Ratzinger said, "Yes, I will come to the Vatican and work for you." His desire was always to go back to teaching. Benedict XVI, at heart, a teacher, a theologian, brilliant mind. But the fact that those two men worked together from 1982 to 2005, and then that teaching that they put out to the world together after all those years was continued by Benedict XVI, was really extraordinary. I really think that era of Catholic teaching will be examined for hundreds of years. The teaching of Ratzinger and Wojtyła, John Paul II, Pope Benedict. So I think there was a great continuity with Benedict being elected. Pope Francis has continued a lot of the things that Benedict and John Paul II taught, particularly about divine mercy. We didn't really get into talking about divine mercy, about that aspect, God's mercy in that teaching. But Ratzinger and Pope Benedict and Pope Francis have both been teaching about God's mercy, which is a beautiful thing. They've been, both of John Paul's successors have continued World Youth Day. They've continued the Wednesday audience in St. Peter's Square. A lot of the same things are happening. I think there is a bit of a departure with Pope Francis because he has a different style than his predecessors. Pope Francis, of course, Italian heritage, raised in Argentina. I was actually in St. Peter's Square when Pope Francis was elected, when he stepped out for the first time. I was there as a journalist, And it was clear right away that this is a pope who was going to do things differently. He is the first pope who was ordained a priest after the end of the Second Vatican Council. He was formed in the seminaries through the 1960s, which we talked about earlier. The seminaries were kind of a mess. He's a Jesuit, and the Jesuit order was kind of a mess through that era. Matter of fact, in the early 80s, John Paul II ousted the head of the Jesuits and put in someone who was more of a traditionalist, if you will. So Pope Francis is just kind of he's different. And we could do a whole podcast on Pope Francis, but at heart, I think he's still carrying out many of the things that we saw with John Paul II and Pope Benedict.
Well, and I'm sure that there will be at least one, probably multiple episodes of the show in the future that do talk about Pope Francis. But Patrick, I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and joining me today. Before we part ways for today, remind the listeners about your book and then about any resources, websites, anything of yours or anyone else's that you would recommend they take a look at after listening to today's conversation.
Yeah, so I wrote my book, 100 Ways John Paul II Changed the World, in honor of John Paul II on his 100th birthday in 2020. It unpacks his legacy and his accomplishments, but it really, it's a simple book that unpacks who this man was and how he changed the world. So people can find that on my website, booksbypatrick.com. It's on Amazon, on wherever else you can buy good Catholic books. I'm leading a pilgrimage to Poland next summer, June of 2024, in the footsteps of John Paul II. People can learn more about that on my Facebook page and also on my website. So I encourage people to go to booksbypatrick.com to learn more about that.
All right. Well, and again, a reminder for everyone that the show notes page for this episode is placesandprofiles.com/8. So there'll be a link to the book, which is again 100 Ways John Paul II Changed the World. Links to CatholicPublicist.com, booksbypatrick.com, your Facebook, your LinkedIn, all of these resources that have been mentioned over the course of this conversation today will be linked on the show notes page for this episode. So again, that is placesandprofiles.com/8, placesandprofiles.com/8. And Patrick, again, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. As we mentioned during the pre-show chat, I don't think I've mentioned this yet during the actual recording of the episode, but I am not Catholic. I am Jewish, but part of this show is, or the main focus of this show, I should say, is looking at the people and the events and the issues that have really shaped places into what they are today. And despite not being Catholic, I certainly recognize the significance on a global stage of Pope John Paul II. And it's hard to think of a more fitting individual from the 20th leading into the 21st centuries to talk about as someone who has really shaped so many places into what they are today. So as a non-Catholic, I was very excited to still nonetheless have this conversation to talk about the life and legacy of such a significant person to the world that we all live in right now. So Patrick, thank you so much for being able to join me to have this conversation and shed some light on just how significant he has been.
Great to be with you, Adam.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.